in medicine in a short period, you need both talent and hard work. That's exactly the kind of young specialist who worked as a neurosurgeon at the regional hospital. His name was Arthur. Despite having only 2 years of experience, Arthur had already earned the respect of his colleagues for his expertise and his quick decision-making, which often saved patients' lives. Tall, handsome, and strong, with a confident gaze and a calm demeanor, Arthur caught the attention of many young nurses. Even seasoned female doctors often lingered in the break room, finding excuses to chat with him. Yet, despite always being polite, Arthur maintained a respectful distance. People attributed a certain romantic mystery to him, and he didn't seem eager to dispel those illusions. His world revolved around his patients and the operating room, where he truly felt in his element, applying his skills and talents. Arthur quickly absorbed techniques from more experienced doctors, wasn't afraid to make tough calls in critical situations, and was a reliable team player. Everyone predicted a bright future for him in surgery and anticipated a successful career trajectory. No one was prouder of him than his mother, Sophia. She had raised him alone since one autumn day when his father left their family, leaving behind only a brief note, "Goodbye. Don't look for me." For Sophia, a nurse, those times were incredibly tough. At first, they barely scraped by, and later, she struggled to find ways to support Arthur's dream of becoming a doctor. Watching successful, well-off surgeons at work, she envisioned a similar life for her only son. Determined to make it happen, Sophia decided Arthur would take out a student loan, and she would help him pay it off as quickly as possible so he could enjoy a life of comfort and success. "Just focus on your studies, son," she had said firmly, and Arthur took his studies seriously. She often saw him up late at night poring over anatomy, histology, surgical techniques, and his chosen, challenging specialty, neurosurgery. The chief of the neurosurgery department quickly noticed Arthur's skills and talent. Arthur was also an active member of the student surgical community. Sophia was delighted to hear about his early accomplishments in surgery. To support him, she continued working as a nurse and sometimes took on additional cleaning jobs. Starting in his 3rd year of medical school, Arthur began working weekend shifts at the hospital, contributing to their shared household budget. Now, as she looked at the man her son had become, Sophia felt a deep sense of pride and relief. "I did it," she thought when Arthur secured his position as a neurosurgeon at the hospital. Arthur married Angela, a fellow doctor at the hospital. Interestingly, they hadn't interacted much at work before, but fate brought them together in an unexpected way. A year ago, Angela was walking home from her shift when she witnessed a car hit a teenager. Without hesitation, she rushed to provide first aid and accompanied him to the hospital in the ambulance. The boy had suffered a spinal fracture, and Arthur was the surgeon who performed the operation. That was when their paths first crossed. A few days later, Angela returned to check on the teenager, and Arthur happened to be examining him in the ward. Arthur later admitted that he was struck by Angela's genuine concern for a stranger and felt a deep connection with her. Over the following weeks, their conversations in the hospital grew longer and increasingly personal, extending beyond discussions about patients. Before long, Arthur realized he wanted to talk to Angela more than anyone else. Angela felt the same way, and their relationship quickly blossomed. Soon, everyone in the hospital knew Arthur was completely devoted to Angela. The young nurses and single female doctors who had once hoped for his attention realized they didn't stand a chance. One evening, while on his shift, Arthur sat in the doctor's lounge, deep in thought about how to propose to Angela in a way that was both beautiful and unique. Ideas flooded his mind, from a romantic dinner to an elaborate surprise, but none of them felt quite right. "It has to be perfect," he thought. "Just asking her to marry me outright? No, that's too plain. Maybe I could hide a ring inside a piece of cake." The idea made him chuckle as he imagined Angela accidentally swallowing the ring. "No way, too risky," he decided. "I'd have to save her afterward." That day's shift hadn't been particularly demanding. The hospital had only scheduled routine surgeries, and, thankfully, there were no emergency cases requiring immediate attention. Arthur hoped the night would remain just as calm, giving him more time to plan his perfect proposal. But Arthur's thoughts and the quiet were interrupted by the shrill ring of the phone. It was Melanie, a nurse from the emergency department, and the urgency in her voice immediately signaled trouble. "Arthur, we've got a new patient. Or rather, someone brought him in," she stammered. "Brought in?" Arthur raised an eyebrow in surprise. Melanie let out an embarrassed chuckle. "They found him right outside the hospital. He looks like a homeless man. He's unconscious and in bad shape. We're trying to stabilize him now." Arthur sighed heavily as he stood up. "Got it, I'm on my way. And for the record, Melanie, homeless people are people too." Still, irritation flickered through his mind. Another person who's let their life spiral out of control. And now it's up to us to save them. Why are they so careless? When Arthur arrived in the ER, he examined the patient. The man appeared to be around 55 years old, though his haggard condition made him seem older. His matted hair, scraggly beard, and general dishevelment told a story of years spent on the streets. The man groaned faintly, his consciousness drifting in and out. After a physical assessment and a CT scan, the diagnosis was clear: a brain hemorrhage. Delaying surgery could mean the difference between life and death. "Let's get him to the OR immediately," Arthur commanded, his voice firm. When the on-duty ER nurse hesitated, citing the lack of consent from any relatives, Arthur cut her off sharply. "We don't have time. If we don't operate within the next 30 minutes, it'll be too late." His tone was resolute, almost authoritative. This unwavering decisiveness was something Arthur had inherited from his mentor, the chief of the department, who often said, "A doctor must make decisions quickly because lives hang in the balance." The patient was moved to the operating room, where the anesthesiologist, Oscar, quickly administered anesthesia. "Arthur, we're ready. You can start," Oscar announced. Arthur was already in full surgical gear. A sterile gown, gloves, and a mask. This was going to be a complicated operation, and a man's life hung in the balance. Steeling himself, Arthur approached the operating table, ready to focus entirely on the task ahead. However, there hadn't been time to ask or learn about the patient's family. When Arthur inquired, a nurse replied, "It doesn't look like he has any relatives. There's no ID, no address, just a document with his name on it." She paused and then added, surprised, "His last name matches yours." Arthur froze. For a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. On the table before him lay the man he had blamed for years of suffering. His own and his mother's. The father who had abandoned them for the allure of a free life, and who now seemed to have hit rock bottom. Arthur's gaze locked on the patient's face. The features were unmistakable. A resemblance to his own face, the same tall frame. "Arthur, what's going on?" Oscar's voice broke the silence. "You look pale. Are you okay?" "It's him," Arthur whispered, barely able to form the words. "Who?" Oscar asked, confused. "It's my father," Arthur replied quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. He couldn't take his eyes off the unconscious man. "The same man who walked out on us when I was 6. Oscar froze, processing what Arthur had just said. "Wow, that's quite the story. Listen, maybe you shouldn't be the one to operate on him. You're emotionally involved, and this might not be the right headspace for you. We can call one of the other neurosurgeons to step in." "No," Arthur said sharply, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "I've got this. To me, he's just a patient." He reached for the scalpel, forcing his emotions aside. In this moment, the man on the table wasn't his father but a person whose life depended entirely on him. The operation was conducted with strict adherence to protocol. With cold precision, Arthur performed the craniotomy and stopped the bleeding, maintaining the appearance of complete detachment. The procedure went smoothly, though the patient took a long time to regain consciousness. By morning, the patient's condition had stabilized. Arthur stepped into the recovery room where his father lay. The man was sleeping, his face no longer as pale or drawn as it had been the night before. Arthur paused at the door for only a moment, then turned and walked away. In the hallway, he stopped, overwhelmed by a strange mixture of relief and bitterness. He had saved a life, not because it was his father, but because he couldn't do otherwise. After all, this was the work he had spent years mastering through 6 grueling years of medical school and 2 years of residency. Yet outside the operating room, this man held no place in his life as a father. Later that morning, during the department's daily briefing, Arthur stayed behind to speak privately with the department chief. Jacob, a silver-haired, slightly weary man with a perpetual air of calm, listened intently as Arthur recounted the situation. "I understand, Arthur," Jacob said with a nod. "I'll assign another attending physician to handle his care. But here's the issue. He's going to need rehabilitation after such a complex operation, and that requires ongoing care. Since he doesn't seem to have any family, we can't just send him back out onto the streets." "Maybe he should just get out of here," Arthur replied coldly, struggling to keep his anger in check. "He chose this life for himself." Jacob fell silent for a moment, then asked thoughtfully, "Arthur, don't you want to know why he ended up like this? Why he became homeless?" "I don't," Arthur snapped, his tone sharp, barely containing his simmering rage. "Why would I? When I think about my mom crying at night, counting every dollar to make sure I had what I needed, and him? He just left. No explanations. Abandoned us. Why would I care to know anything about him?" Jacob sighed and shook his head. "I wouldn't wish a father like that on anyone," he muttered. Arthur decided that it was best to keep his mother in the dark about what had happened. She had come to terms with her husband's disappearance long ago, and dredging up the past would only disturb her hard-won peace. Her kind heart would never allow her to leave her ex-husband in such dire straits, and Arthur didn't want her to go through more suffering. Angela supported his decision. "Your mom doesn't need to know. She's already made her peace with his disappearance, and bringing this up now would only reopen old wounds," she said firmly. Angela, however, insisted that Arthur find a shelter for his father. She took the initiative to contact social services, and a temporary home was arranged. Arthur planned to pass the address along through a colleague, but at the last minute, he realized he needed to speak to his father himself. He resolved to do so after his father was discharged from the hospital. That evening, Angela left for a night shift, while Arthur stayed home, lost in thought. The day had been emotionally overwhelming. Thoughts of his father clashed with his worries about his mother and how this situation might affect her. Suddenly, the sharp ring of his phone pulled him out of his reverie. It was a call from the department chief, and Jacob's voice sounded serious. "Arthur, sorry to disturb you. We've got a critical case, a patient in severe condition. We need you for an emergency surgery. Can you come in?" Arthur instinctively shifted into action mode. He was used to calls like this at any hour. Within minutes, he was on his way back to the hospital. When Arthur entered the hospital, the tension in the air was palpable. His colleagues were waiting for him in the operating room, but as he passed by the staff lounge, something caught his eye. Through the slightly ajar door, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Angela, his wife, was in the arms of another doctor, Marvin, a surgeon, and they were kissing. She looked flustered but didn't pull away from him. Arthur froze for a moment, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He pushed the door open wider, and his gaze locked with Angela's. Her face turned pale as she realized, to her horror, that her husband had seen everything. Marvin quickly stepped back, his hand dropping to his side, and began to stammer something, but Arthur raised a hand, signaling for silence. "What's going on here?" Arthur asked, his voice unnervingly calm as he stared directly at Angela. Inside, though, a storm of anger and betrayal raged. Angela fumbled for words. "Arthur, it's not what it looks like. We were just talking." "Talking?" He cut her off, his jaw clenched. "A little late for a conversation, don't you think? Especially one in that tone." Marvin attempted to interject, but Arthur's cold glare stopped him in his tracks. "I'm not talking to you," Arthur said icily. Angela lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. Her silence confirmed Arthur's worst fears. The woman he had trusted, the woman he thought was his soulmate, had betrayed him. "I'm going to the operating room now to save someone's life," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. After that, we're going to have a serious conversation." With that, he turned and walked toward the oar, leaving Angela and Marvin standing in stunned silence behind him. The surgery was a success, but Arthur struggled to focus throughout. Every step, every action felt mechanical, driven by years of experience rather than any sense of inner calm. His mind kept replaying the scene in the staff lounge over and over. When he stepped out of the operating room, Angela was waiting for him in the hallway. She started to speak, trying to explain herself, but Arthur stopped her with a firm hand. "Not now. I'm too tired to deal with this. Tomorrow. At home," he said. He left her standing there, looking confused and unsure, and walked outside, hoping to clear his mind. The cold night air hit his face, and he felt the crushing weight of everything that had happened. In a single night, the foundations of his life, his family, his relationship, his sense of stability had crumbled. But even in the midst of his pain, Arthur knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had to stay strong. For himself, for his mother, and for his patients who depended on him. Later, Arthur returned home and collapsed onto his bed, exhausted after the day's events. Yet sleep didn't come. His thoughts kept circling back to Angela's betrayal. He couldn't understand why she had done it or what had been missing in their relationship. Their marriage had seemed so solid, so full of promise. And now it was gone. He finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning. When he woke, he found Angela sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee, waiting for him. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She tried to speak, but Arthur gestured for her to stop. "Angela," he began, sitting down across from her. His voice was steady but devoid of anger. "I thought you were the person I could build a life with. But after what happened, I can't do this anymore. I respect myself and my feelings too much. We need to end this." "Arthur, please," she began, her voice trembling, but he raised his hand to cut her off. "I gave you all my trust, and you broke it. There's no excuse for betrayal. I don't want to discuss this any further. I'm filing for divorce. That's final." With that, he stood up and walked into the bedroom, leaving Angela sobbing on the couch. His heart felt heavy, but his decision was made. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't stay with someone who had betrayed him. Meanwhile, Arthur's father was recovering. Arthur deliberately avoided visiting his father's room, instructing his colleagues to tell the man that another doctor had performed the surgery. But as the day of discharge approached, doubt gnawed at Arthur. Could he really send the man back to the streets? Was that the kind of person he had been raised to be? Would that truly be the right thing to do? After all, people wouldn't abandon a stray animal so easily. This was a human being. Questions swirled relentlessly in his mind. Why had his father done it? Why had he left them? Finally, Arthur made the decision to step into the room. Alex was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head wrapped in bandages, gazing wearily out the window where the first snowflakes of winter were drifting down. On the bedside table in front of him sat a plate of cold porridge and a cup of tea, untouched. The man looked lost, immersed in his thoughts. This is going to be a long and difficult conversation, Arthur thought as he studied him. Alex's dull eyes, deep lines etched into his face, and the sheer exhaustion of a life lived hard painted a stark picture. 55 years old, the age where life should be vibrant and active, not drained and beaten. Once he had been different, confident, strong, full of plans for the future. But the years had cruelly erased all that, leaving behind memories that pierced his heart with every thought. Thoughts of Sophia and Arthur haunted him. Where was Sophia now? How was she? And his son, Arthur? Alex had no doubt that his boy had grown into a smart, strong man. Sophia would have made sure of that. She had always been responsible and a good mother. She would have supported their son and raised him to be a decent human being. The rumors about a talented surgeon named Arthur had spread through the hospital, and Alex had heard them too. Tall, strong, with a piercing gaze, he was like a mirror image of himself in his youth. But how could he approach him? Alex had only caught glimpses of the white coat moving through the hallways as he struggled to relearn how to walk after the surgery. Now, with Arthur standing in the doorway, Alex's thoughts and regrets swirled even more heavily in his tired mind. The door to the hospital room suddenly opened. Alex looked up, and there he was, the surgeon everyone had been talking about. Arthur stepped inside, pulled up a chair, and sat directly across from him, fixing Alex with a heavy, penetrating gaze. It was a look that seemed to weigh whether this conversation was even worth having. "Doctor, is there something you need?" Alex asked cautiously, trying to mask his growing unease. "Yes, there is," Arthur replied, his voice cold and detached. "Do you even understand who's sitting in front of you?" Alex froze, his heart pounding faster. "Nikitka, is it really you?" he stammered, his voice trembling. "Son." "Yes, it's me." Arthur cut him off sharply, leaning in closer. "But don't get too excited. You're not my father. You're the man who abandoned me and my mother 25 years ago." "Arthur, I... Alex stammered, his voice faltering. "I've thought about you every day. I wanted to find you and your mother, but when I came back, you didn't live at the old address anymore." His words trailed off as Arthur's icy stare bore into him. "Thought about us?" Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "Don't say something so ridiculous. You vanished. You erased us from your life. And now fate brought us back together only because you ended up on my operating table. But they told me it was a different doctor who performed the surgery." Alex began, fumbling for some sort of defense. "What difference does that make?" Arthur snapped, his tone sharp. "Yes, I operated on you. But that doesn't matter now. Don't expect any kind of sympathy from me after what you did to me and my mother. I don't care what happened to you all these years." Arthur reached into his coat pocket and threw a folded piece of paper onto the bed. "Here's the address of a social service center. They help people like you. Go there." With that, he stood and walked out of the room, leaving Alex alone with his thoughts and the paper that seemed heavier than it should have been. He began to walk out, but Alex suddenly called out, "Wait, Arthur. How's your mother? Where is she? How's she doing?" Arthur stopped at the door and turned around. "She's living her life the best she can, and she doesn't need you anymore. She buried you a long time ago," he said sharply. "Arthur, please just listen," Alex pleaded desperately. "You need to know the truth. Things weren't the way you think." Arthur hesitated, then slowly walked back and sat down across from him. "You have 5 minutes," he said coldly. "After that, I have other patients to see." Alex took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. It was over 25 years ago when everyone was rushing into business ventures. I thought I could do it too. I invested everything into renting a store, renovating it, and stocking it with merchandise. First, everything was great. We bought a car, made the down payment on a house, and I was keeping up with the mortgage. We even went on a family trip to Europe. You probably don't remember, but you were so happy. And your mom, she was so proud of us." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But then it all fell apart. One night, the store burned down. My insurance had expired, and I hadn't renewed it in time. Everything we had was gone in the fire." Alex clenched his hands into fists, his voice trembling as he spoke. "All the merchandise was bought on credit. I sold the car, but it wasn't enough to cover the loans. I didn't want to sell the house because even after paying off the mortgage, it wouldn't have been enough to clear the debts. And I couldn't leave you homeless." His voice softened, and his gaze dropped to his tightly clenched hands. "The only option I saw was to become a long-haul truck driver. The company gave me a truck to live in, and I thought, I'll do this for a few years and then come back to you. But the job, it pulls you in. And a few years turned into more than 2 decades. Every time I thought about coming back, I convinced myself you were better off without me, that you didn't need me. But now I see I was wrong." Alex's voice cracked, and he fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Arthur remained silent, his face an unreadable mask. Finally he spoke, his tone measured. "If all of this is true, then why didn't you come back when you could?" "I tried," Alex exclaimed, his voice breaking. "But everything had changed. The people I knew turned their backs on me. You know, I didn't have anyone, no family except you. I was nothing, nobody. Arthur stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the snow, which had blanketed the gray landscape outside the hospital, transforming it into a pristine, white expanse. You want me to understand? To forgive you? He said, his voice quiet but laced with pain. But how can I forget all those nights when Mom cried herself to sleep? And I... His voice faltered, tension thick in the air. I hated you. How can I just understand you now? Alex was breathing heavily, fighting back tears. Arthur stood at the window for what felt like an eternity, as though searching for answers in the snow-covered view. Finally, he turned and walked back, sitting down next to Alex. Dad, he said softly, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability. In the end, neither Mom nor I really knew what had happened to you. We believed you had left us for another woman. I need time to process this, everything you've told me. Forgive me for my harshness. Alex lifted his head, tears glistening in his eyes. No, son, he whispered, his voice trembling. You're the one who needs to forgive me. They embraced, both of them holding on as if to bridge the chasm that had separated them for so many years. Standing in the doorway was Jacob, the department chief, who had been watching the scene quietly. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a gentle smile. Family must learn to forgive, he said softly before stepping away, leaving father and son to their long-awaited reunion. That evening, Arthur brought his father home. He went inside first, sitting his mother down to explain everything that had happened with Alex. When he finally brought his father into the apartment, Sophia couldn't believe her eyes at first. It was as though time had played a cruel trick, bringing back the man who had disappeared so many years ago. But when she saw Alex standing there, she simply said, "Hello, Alex." Alex, uncertain of how to respond, whispered, "I've come back. Will you take me in?" Sophia gently placed her arms around his shoulders. "Alex, Arthur told me why you felt you had to leave us, why you made the difficult choice to handle those problems alone for what you thought was the good of our family. Of course, I'll take you in. Look at our son. He's grown into a man, and he looks so much like you. The best man I could ever hope for." The three of them stood there, embraced in silence, a moment so profound that words felt unnecessary. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than anything words can convey. The following week, Arthur filed for divorce from Angela. The process was swift, as they had no children, sold their house, paid off their loan, and split the remaining money equally. As Arthur began rebuilding his relationship with his father, he discovered something he hadn't expected. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Years of pain and distance couldn't be erased overnight, but it was a start. They began to talk, awkwardly at first but with genuine sincerity. Alex shared stories of his life, his mistakes, and his regrets. Slowly, Arthur started to see Alex as a person, not just a ghost from the past. Life is a series of losses and gains. Arthur had lost a wife he once trusted, but he found a path to reconnect with his father. Forgiveness isn't always easy. It often demands more strength than holding on to anger. But sometimes it's what we need to move forward. Life is a delicate balance of what we lose and what we gain, and ultimately, it's up to us to decide how we continue our journey.